The SAS had proven itself to be one of the most elite and effective special forces units of World War II. Their unconventional warfare tactics, deep behind enemy lines operations, and sabotage missions had disrupted German forces across North Africa, Europe, and beyond. They were the masters of deception, speed, and brutality. But despite their success, by the time the war ended in 1945, the British government made a shocking decision: the SAS was to be disbanded. At the heart of this decision was the belief that special forces were no longer necessary in a post-war world. The SAS had been designed for a very specific purpose: small teams of elite soldiers launching daring raids against Nazi and Axis forces. But with Hitler defeated and the war won, the British military began scaling down its wartime units, focusing on conventional forces for a new era of peacetime. On October 8, 1945, the SAS was officially disbanded. The men who had risked their lives behind enemy lines, blowing up bridges, derailing trains, and assassinating high-ranking officers, suddenly found themselves without a unit. Many returned to civilian life, while others joined more conventional regiments within the British Army. But what the government failed to realize was that war was far from over. The world was shifting into a new kind of conflict. The Cold War was beginning, and British interests were already under threat across the globe. While the SAS had been formally disbanded, many of its veterans were unwilling to let its legacy die. One of the most determined was Major David Stirling, the original founder of the SAS, and his wartime comrade Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne. Both men understood that warfare was evolving and that small, highly trained special operations units would still be needed in the conflicts to come. During this period, SAS soldiers were quietly recruited into unofficial special operations roles. Many former SAS men were absorbed into the Territorial Army, the British Special Boat Service (SBS), and even MI6's covert operations. Some found themselves working in Palestine, Malaya, and other British-controlled regions, where insurgencies and uprisings were beginning to take shape. By 1947, it became increasingly clear that Britain had made a mistake in disbanding the SAS. The British Empire was facing rising tensions in Palestine, Malaya, and Aden, where conventional military forces were struggling to contain guerrilla fighters. Special operations were once again needed. Under the direction of key military figures, the SAS was quietly resurrected, not as a large-scale wartime unit, but as a small, highly secretive regiment specializing in counterinsurgency and deep reconnaissance. This new SAS would focus on jungle warfare, urban counterterrorism, and intelligence gathering, skills that would prove invaluable in the conflicts to come. One of the first true rebirths of the SAS came in the form of 21 SAS Regiment, a territorial army unit that would serve as the foundation for the modern SAS we know today. This was the beginning of a new era for special forces warfare. The days of massive armies clashing in open battlefields were fading, and covert, strategic warfare was rising. The SAS was officially back in business, but they weren't the same unit that had fought the Nazis in the deserts of North Africa or the forests of Europe. They were leaner, deadlier, and preparing for a new kind of war, one that would take them deep into the jungles of Malaya, the deserts of the Middle East, and the shadows of the Cold War. The rebirth of the SAS in 1947 was not just a return, it was a reinvention. While the World War II SAS had operated in deserts, mountains, and European forests, the new SAS was about to face a completely different kind of war. A war fought in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Malaya, against an enemy that refused to engage in traditional battles. The Malayan Emergency 1948–1960 was one of Britain's first major post-war conflicts, and it became the perfect proving ground for the SAS's new counterinsurgency doctrine. After World War II, the British Empire was struggling to maintain control over its colonies, and Malaya, rich in resources like rubber and tin, was a key economic asset. But a growing communist insurgency led by the Malayan National Liberation Army (MNLA) was threatening British rule. These insurgents, hardened by their resistance against the Japanese occupation, now turned their focus on the British. The problem? This wasn't a conventional army. The MNLA operated in small mobile units, striking British forces with ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and guerrilla tactics, then disappearing into the thick jungle. Conventional British troops, trained for European warfare, struggled to adapt. This was exactly the kind of warfare the newly reformed SAS had been designed to fight. In 1950, 22 SAS Regiment was officially formed, and their first deployment was to Malaya. Their mission? To hunt, track, and eliminate communist insurgents deep within the jungle. This was a war unlike any other. The enemy didn't wear uniforms, they blended in with civilians. The battlefield was a vast, dense jungle, thick with humidity, disease, and hidden dangers. Standard British military tactics were useless. Mass troop movements and armored vehicles had no place in the jungle. To win this war, the SAS completely reinvented their approach to combat. Jungle survival and tracking. The SAS learned to live off the land, drinking from vines, hunting local wildlife, and mastering jungle survival. Small team raids. Instead of large-scale battles, four-man SAS patrols would insert deep into enemy territory, tracking insurgents for days before launching precise surgical strikes. Psychological warfare. The SAS used fear tactics, launching surprise attacks at night, making the enemy believe they were being hunted at all times. Helicopter insertions. For the first time, the SAS pioneered the use of helicopters to quickly deploy and extract troops, a tactic that would later be used in Vietnam and modern special forces operations. The British government initially underestimated the SAS's role, but their success quickly became undeniable. The SAS began striking deep into communist jungle strongholds, tracking down enemy cells and eliminating them one by one. They became so feared that the insurgents gave them a name, the Ghost Soldiers. One of the most famous tactics developed in Malaya was pseudo-operations. SAS soldiers, along with native trackers, would disguise themselves as guerrillas, infiltrate enemy networks, and turn the insurgents against each other. This was one of the earliest uses of deep cover operations, something that would later define special forces warfare. By the mid-1950s, the tide had turned. The SAS's tactics, combined with intelligence-led operations, forced the insurgents into retreat. By 1960, the Malayan emergency was effectively over, marking one of Britain's most successful counter-insurgency campaigns. The Malayan emergency cemented the SAS as the world's premier counter-insurgency force. Their success here reshaped modern warfare, proving that small, highly trained teams could dismantle entire enemy networks. But their work was far from over. As the Cold War intensified, new threats emerged, and the SAS would soon find itself deployed in Aden, Borneo, and beyond. By the 1960s, the British Empire was unraveling. Decolonization was in full swing, and as British forces withdrew from key regions, new conflicts erupted. The SAS, fresh from their success in Malaya, found themselves in two completely different battlegrounds, one in the dense jungles of Borneo, the other in the dangerous streets of Aden, Yemen. These two conflicts pushed the SAS to evolve even further, shifting from jungle counterinsurgency to urban warfare and close-quarters battles CQB. Aden, a strategic port in modern-day Yemen, was a British-controlled colony, but it was quickly becoming a powder keg. Anti-British insurgents, supported by Egyptian and Soviet-backed forces, launched bombings, assassinations, and ambushes against British troops. Unlike Malaya, where the SAS operated deep in the jungle, Aden forced them into a new kind of war, an urban guerrilla war where the enemy blended into the local population, launching attacks in broad daylight and disappearing into the crowded streets. The SAS were sent in to do what conventional British troops couldn't: neutralize insurgents before they could strike. To do this, they developed a revolutionary new tactic. The four-man close-quarter battle CQB team leader calls the shots and provides cover. Breacher blows through doors and barriers. Point man enters first, clearing rooms. Rear guard watches their back, covering exits. This four-man team structure became the blueprint for modern-day counterterrorism units, including SWAT teams and military special forces worldwide. The SAS also pioneered the use of undercover surveillance units, blending in with the locals, dressing like civilians, and tracking down insurgent leaders before they could attack. They hunted bomb makers, assassins, and guerrilla leaders, using quick response tactics and brutal direct action raids. These missions were highly effective but also extremely dangerous. Aden was one of the first places where SAS soldiers faced suicide bombers and roadside IEDs. By 1967, Britain withdrew from Aden, but the lessons the SAS learned here would shape the future of urban counterterrorism warfare. The Borneo Confrontation, 1963 to 1966, the SAS in another jungle war. At the same time as the Aden conflict, another war was brewing in Borneo. This was a different kind of fight, back to the jungle warfare tactics the SAS had mastered in Malaya. The conflict Indonesia, under President Sukarno, launched a campaign to take control of Malaysian territories, using Indonesian guerrilla fighters to launch cross-border attacks into Borneo. The British, alongside Malaysian and Australian forces, sent the SAS in to stop them. The SAS were deployed behind enemy lines, conducting some of their most secretive and dangerous operations to date. Their job? Track down Indonesian forces before they could attack British and Malaysian outposts. launch lightning-fast ambushes on enemy patrols, sabotage supply lines, and disrupt enemy movements. They were so deep in enemy territory that they had to be dropped in by parachute or inserted by boat, relying entirely on their tracking skills, jungle survival techniques, and small unit tactics. One of the most daring innovations during this campaign was Claret operations, covert cross-border raids into Indonesia that were never officially acknowledged at the time. The SAS would secretly enter Indonesian territory, strike enemy camps, and withdraw without leaving a trace. These missions were highly classified for decades, as Britain didn't want to admit they were conducting secret raids on foreign soil. Elite native trackers, the Aden headhunters, to navigate the dense, unforgiving jungles of Borneo. The SAS worked closely with Aden tribesmen, legendary headhunters known for their tracking and survival skills. These indigenous warriors guided SAS patrols, teaching them how to detect enemy movements, set traps, and navigate the jungle using natural signs. The Aden trackers were so deadly that Indonesian soldiers feared them more than the SAS itself. The lessons from Aden and Borneo transformed the SAS into the world's most adaptable special forces unit. In Aden, they learned urban counterinsurgency, surveillance, and hostage rescue tactics. In Borneo, they perfected covert reconnaissance, jungle warfare, and deep insertion raids. These skills would later become the foundation of modern SAS operations, influencing their role in the Falklands, the Gulf War, and global counterterrorism. The SAS had mastered the jungle and conquered the city, but their next challenge would be one of their most famous and daring operations yet. The 1970s would introduce the world to the SAS in a way never seen before. Up next, the birth of counterterrorism, the 1970s, and the Iranian embassy siege. By the 1970s, the world was changing, and so was warfare. The SAS had mastered jungle warfare in Malaya and Borneo, and urban counterinsurgency in Aden, but a new threat was emerging: international terrorism. Planes were being hijacked, embassies were being stormed, and terrorists were taking hostages, using them as bargaining chips in political conflicts. Governments were struggling to respond. This was a new kind of warfare, fast, unpredictable, and deadly. It was during this time that the SAS would reinvent itself once again, shifting from jungle and guerrilla warfare to counterterrorism and hostage rescue operations. The tactics they developed in the 1970s would set the standard for special forces worldwide. During the 1970s, terrorist groups like the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, the IRA, Irish Republican Army, and the Badr Meinhof gang were carrying out high-profile attacks across Europe and the Middle East. 1972 Munich Olympics massacre: Palestinian terrorists from Black September stormed the Olympic Village, taking Israeli athletes hostage. The German police attempted a rescue, but their lack of specialized training led to a disastrous operation, resulting in all the hostages being killed. Multiple airline hijackings, planes were being seized mid-flight, with terrorists demanding ransoms, political concessions, or prisoner exchanges. The IRA bombing campaign: the Provisional IRA launched a wave of attacks across the UK, including bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, targeting both civilians and military personnel. Governments realized they needed a new kind of force, one that could respond instantly to terrorist threats. The SAS was chosen to lead this transformation. In 1972, the British government officially tasked 22 SAS Regiment with counter-terrorism duties, forming the now legendary Counter-Revolutionary Warfare (CRW) wing. This unit was trained for one mission above all else: hostage rescue. The birth of the SAS Close Quarters Battle (CQB) tactics, room clearing and dynamic entry, learning how to breach and secure buildings in seconds, flashbangs and shock tactics, using speed, aggression, and surprise to overwhelm terrorists. Live fire training, conducting drills using real weapons, live ammunition, and real hostages to ensure no mistakes under pressure. Psychological warfare, making terrorists believe that SAS forces were always watching, always ready to strike. This was the first fully dedicated counterterrorism unit in the Western world. The SAS were no longer just soldiers, they were specialists in extreme high-risk rescues. At the same time, the SAS was also fighting a secret war in Northern Ireland. The Provisional IRA had launched a brutal guerrilla war against British rule, targeting soldiers, police, and civilians in a bloody campaign of bombings and assassinations. Unlike conventional troops, the SAS went undercover, working in small elite surveillance teams to track IRA cells and conduct targeted killings of their leadership. Notable SAS operations in Northern Ireland are Operation Flavius, 1988, a controversial SAS ambush in Gibraltar, where 3 unarmed IRA members were killed. Covert four-man teams, pioneering surveillance and intelligence-gathering tactics that modern special forces still use today. False flag operations. SAS soldiers disguised themselves as civilians or IRA members, infiltrating terror cells and turning them against each other. The SAS's methods were highly classified, but incredibly effective, so much so that IRA members feared being hunted at all times. Everything the SAS had trained for, their counterterrorism tactics, hostage rescue skills, and room-clearing drills, would be put to the ultimate test in one of the most televised special forces operations in history. On April 30th, 1980, 6 armed terrorists stormed the Iranian embassy in London, taking 26 hostages. They demanded the release of prisoners in Iran, threatening to execute hostages one by one if their demands weren't met. For 6 days, the world watched as negotiators tried to de-escalate the situation, but when the terrorists killed a hostage and threw his body out the door, the British government gave the green light. The SAS would go in. On May 5, 1980, the world witnessed Operation Nimrod, the first ever televised hostage rescue by an elite special forces unit. The world was in awe. For the first time, the SAS was no longer a secretive regiment, it was now a legend. Every special forces unit in the world, from Delta Force to GSG-9, from SWAT teams to Navy SEALs, studied the SAS Iranian embassy raid. It became the gold standard for hostage rescues. The 1970s had been a turning point. The SAS had evolved from jungle fighters to the world's top counter-terrorism unit. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were an elite global force, feared by terrorists and respected by military leaders worldwide. But as the 1980s arrived, new wars were waiting. Up next, the Falklands War, the SAS in extreme conditions. By 1982, the SAS had already proven itself in jungle warfare, urban counterterrorism, and deep cover operations. But now they would face a new battlefield, the freezing, windswept terrain of the South Atlantic. The Falklands War was Britain's first conventional military conflict since World War II, and the SAS would be at the very tip of the spear. This war tested their endurance, adaptability, and ability to conduct high-risk operations behind enemy lines. This wasn't a fight against insurgents or terrorists. This was war against a national military force, the Argentine Army. The Falklands War started on April 2, 1982, when Argentina invaded the British-controlled Falkland Islands, a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic. The British government under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher refused to back down. A massive naval task force was assembled to sail 8,000 miles across the ocean, carrying thousands of British troops, including the SAS and SBS Special Boat Service. Their mission? To take back the Falklands by any means necessary. Before the main invasion force could land, the SAS needed to gather intelligence on Argentine troop movements, weapon placements, and possible weaknesses. SAS teams were inserted by helicopter onto the islands, setting up observation posts on high ground. They spent days watching, tracking, and reporting on enemy activities, using their legendary fieldcraft to remain undetected. One of their key discoveries? The Argentine forces were spread thin and poorly trained. But the harsh conditions made things almost impossible. Freezing rain, hurricane-force winds, and temperatures that could kill an unprepared soldier in hours. One of the most critical SAS missions of the war took place at Pebble Island, where Argentina had an airbase housing 11 aircraft that were threatening the British fleet. If those planes could launch, they could devastate British ships and slow the invasion. The plan? 45 SAS troopers were flown in by helicopter at night. They crawled through the freezing terrain, avoiding enemy patrols. They planted explosive charges on every aircraft, ensuring they would never fly again. At dawn, they launched a full-scale assault, engaging Argentine troops in a firefight. Within minutes, the entire airfield was ablaze, and all 11 aircraft were destroyed. As the British main force began landing, the SAS were deployed behind enemy lines to cause chaos and confusion. They cut enemy supply lines, making sure Argentine forces couldn't resupply their troops. They launched diversionary attacks, drawing Argentine soldiers away from key defensive positions. They destroyed radar installations, leaving Argentine commanders blind to British movements. One of their most important missions? Guiding British Harrier jets onto enemy targets, using laser designators, ensuring precision airstrikes that wiped out Argentine bunkers and positions. The Goose Green Battle was one of the war's most important victories, paving the way for British forces to push forward. One of the most intense SAS missions of the war took place at Mount Kent, a strategic high ground that both British and Argentine special forces were fighting to control. The Argentine 602 Commando Company, an elite special forces unit, was sent to seize the mountain before the British arrived. But the SAS got there first. The engagement was epic. A brutal night battle erupted in the darkness, with SAS and Argentine commandos exchanging heavy gunfire at close range. Both sides used night vision, suppressors, and ambush tactics, a true special forces versus special forces engagement. After hours of fighting, the SAS forced the Argentine commandos to retreat, securing the mountain. This victory gave the British a crucial vantage point over the battlefield. Not every SAS mission in the Falklands went smoothly. One of the biggest disasters occurred when an SAS patrol was sent on a long-range reconnaissance mission in extreme conditions. Due to a miscalculation by their commander, the team was dropped too far from their extraction point, forcing them to march for days in brutal freezing temperatures. Multiple men suffered frostbite. One was so badly affected he had to be carried. Some nearly died of exposure. Eventually, a Royal Navy helicopter, call sign Bravo November, conducted a daring rescue, saving the SAS team from almost certain death. This showed just how unforgiving the Falklands terrain was, even for the best-trained soldiers in the world. By June 14, 1982, British forces had recaptured the Falklands, forcing Argentina to surrender. The war was over, but the SAS's legend had only grown stronger. This war proved that the SAS could operate in any environment: desert, jungle, urban, and now freezing mountains. The Falklands was a brutal, fast-paced war that pushed the SAS to their limits. But their next challenge would take them to the deserts of the Middle East, where they would conduct one of the most famous SAS missions of all time, Bravo 20. By 1991, the SAS had already fought in jungles, mountains, cities, and the frozen terrain of the Falklands. But now they faced a new battlefield: the vast, unforgiving deserts of Iraq. This was a war of high-tech weapons, rapid mobility, and elite special forces missions. It was also a war where the SAS would undertake one of their most famous and controversial missions, Bravo 20. For the first time since World War II, the SAS were fighting against a fully equipped modern army, using stealth, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla tactics to disrupt enemy forces from behind the lines. When Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded Kuwait in August 1990, it sparked an international crisis. The US-led coalition, including Britain, prepared for a full-scale war to liberate Kuwait and defeat Iraq's massive military force. As the main invasion force prepared for battle, the SAS were sent in first. Their mission: deep reconnaissance, infiltrate Iraq to locate enemy positions, airfields, and missile sites. Hunting Scud missile launchers. Iraq was firing Scud missiles at Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the SAS were sent to find and destroy them before they could cause mass casualties. Sabotage and disruption. Strike key communication hubs, supply lines, and fuel depots to weaken the Iraqi army before the full-scale attack began. This was modern warfare, and the SAS led the charge behind enemy lines. Bravo 20, one of the most legendary yet disastrous missions in SAS history. It was the Gulf War, and 8 SAS troopers were sent deep into Iraq with orders to locate and destroy a highly secretive Scud missile site. Inserted by helicopter under the cover of darkness, they carried heavy loads of equipment, weapons, and survival gear. Their mission was clear: find the Scud launchers, destroy them, and escape undetected. But almost immediately, everything went wrong. Shortly after insertion, their radio communications failed. They were completely cut off from command. Then they were spotted by a local Iraqi goat herder. The SAS had two choices: kill the witness or let him go. They chose the latter. Minutes later, an Iraqi patrol was hunting them down. The team evaded capture for hours, but soon they were outnumbered and outgunned. As the freezing desert night set in, they attempted to exfiltrate towards Syria, covering hundreds of miles on foot with barely any food or water. The team was forced to split up. One SAS soldier, Chris Ryan, managed to escape alone, marching an astonishing 300 kilometers over 8 days without being caught, the longest escape and evasion in SAS history. 3 of his teammates were killed in action, while the remaining 4 were captured and subjected to brutal torture by Iraqi forces. Their mission had ultimately failed, but their survival against impossible odds cemented Bravo 20 as one of the most infamous SAS operations ever. But Bravo 20 was only one part of the SAS's larger role in the Gulf War. The Iraqi army had been launching Scud missiles at Israel and Saudi Arabia, hoping to escalate the conflict and fracture the US-led coalition. The SAS were deployed into western Iraq, deep behind enemy lines, tasked with hunting down and eliminating these missile launchers before they could be fired. Disguised as Iraqi forces, SAS teams ambushed convoys, sabotaged launch sites, and directed precision airstrikes on enemy positions. Their relentless efforts significantly reduced Iraq's ability to fire Scud missiles, preventing a wider war. The SAS also played a crucial role in crippling Iraq's military infrastructure. They targeted key roads, bridges, and fuel depots, cutting off critical supply lines. They took out command centers, radio stations, and vital communication hubs, leaving Iraqi commanders in complete disarray. Though the Iraqi military was already struggling against the overwhelming firepower of the coalition, the SAS's deep strikes accelerated their collapse. The Gulf War lasted only 6 weeks, and by February 1991, Iraq had been pushed out of Kuwait with Saddam's forces in full retreat. The SAS had once again proven that special forces were not just elite warriors, but also force multipliers, capable of disrupting entire enemy operations, guiding airstrikes, and dismantling critical infrastructure with precision and speed. The lessons learned in the Gulf War, particularly from Bravo 20, would shape future SAS missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. By the early 2000s, the SAS had already built a legendary reputation, but a new global threat was about to redefine their role: the War on Terror. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the world changed overnight. The United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, targeting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, while in 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom led to the invasion of Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. The SAS were at the forefront of both wars, working alongside U.S. Delta Force, Navy SEAL Team 6, and the CIA, engaging in some of the most intense combat in their history. But this was no longer conventional warfare. This was an era of counterinsurgency, covert assassinations, high-value target raids, and relentless urban combat. The war in Afghanistan began with a single objective: find and eliminate Osama bin Laden and dismantle Al-Qaeda's stronghold. The SAS were among the first special forces units on the ground, launching direct action raids alongside Delta Force and the CIA's Special Activities Division. One of their first major operations was the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, a fierce engagement deep in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. Fighting through a complex network of caves and tunnels, SAS teams engaged Al-Qaeda forces in brutal close-quarters combat, but despite relentless bombardment and multiple SAS-led assaults, bin Laden managed to escape, possibly into Pakistan, where he would remain hidden for another decade. Although he evaded capture, this mission set the tone for the next decade. The SAS would be relentlessly hunting terrorist leaders across Afghanistan and beyond. The war quickly shifted from a conventional invasion into a long, grinding counterinsurgency fight. The SAS were called upon to do what they did best: tracking, ambushing, and eliminating enemy commanders before they could strike. They conducted classified kill or capture missions, eliminating high-value Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders through rapid helicopter insertions, precision house raids, and quick extractions. The SAS played a major role in Helmand Province, one of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan, where they trained Afghan commandos, conducted sniper operations, and launched hit-and-run attacks on Taliban strongholds. They also pioneered the use of drones, thermal imaging, and advanced surveillance technology, ensuring they were always one step ahead of the enemy. By 2010, SAS operations had severely weakened the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but another war zone was already demanding their attention: Iraq. In 2003, the US and UK launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq, claiming that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Whether those claims were justified or not, Saddam's regime collapsed within weeks, and the war quickly turned into a brutal insurgency. The SAS had two primary objectives in Iraq: track down and eliminate Saddam Hussein and his key commanders, and counter the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would later evolve into ISIS. The hunt for Saddam Hussein culminated in Operation Red Dawn in December 2003, where U.S. Delta Force captured Saddam in a small underground bunker near Tikrit. While the final raid was conducted by American Special Forces, the SAS played a critical role in intelligence gathering, interrogating Saddam's captured bodyguards, and narrowing down his location. But with Saddam gone, Iraq quickly descended into chaos, and the SAS found themselves in the thick of an urban war like no other. In the Battle of Basra 2003 to 2007, the SAS led high-risk night raids on insurgent bomb-making factories, disguised themselves as Iraqi civilians to infiltrate enemy networks, and worked closely with MI6 and U.S. Special Forces to dismantle terror cells. One of their most daring missions came in 2005 when two undercover SAS operatives were captured by Iraqi police, tortured, and nearly executed. In an unprecedented move, British forces stormed the Iraqi prison with tanks, breaking the SAS operatives out before they could be handed over to insurgents. During the height of the Iraqi insurgency, the SAS formed Task Force Black, an ultra-secretive unit working directly under U.S. Joint Special Operations Command JSOC. Hunt down and eliminate the most dangerous insurgent leaders, take out bomb makers responsible for deadly IED attacks, and rescue hostages held by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This unit operated in total secrecy, launching high-risk operations in Baghdad and other insurgent strongholds. As Al-Qaeda in Iraq grew stronger, so did their brutal tactics, suicide bombings, executions, and mass attacks on coalition forces. One of the SAS's most important missions was eliminating Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the notorious leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a man responsible for some of the deadliest attacks of the war. The SAS provided critical intelligence that led to a precision airstrike in 2006, killing Zarqawi and crippling Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but the war was far from over. ISIS would later rise from the ashes of Zarqawi's network, evolving into an even greater threat. By 2011, US and UK forces withdrew from Iraq, but the SAS remained active, training Iraqi special forces and preparing for the next battle. Their work in Iraq and Afghanistan had cemented their status as one of the most battle-hardened, experienced special forces units in history. But their next war would be even more complex, a war against ISIS, Russian-backed forces in Syria, and global terror networks operating in the shadows. The SAS had spent a decade fighting in the Middle East, evolving into one of the most advanced and lethal special forces units in the world. But as the 2010s arrived, new threats emerged: ISIS, the Syrian civil war, and the rise of hybrid warfare. The SAS were not done yet. By 2010, the world's battlefield had changed once again. Terrorism was no longer centralized. It had spread across the globe. The biggest threat? The rise of ISIS, Islamic State, an ultra-violent terrorist group that declared a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. What followed was one of the most brutal and chaotic conflicts of the modern era, with the SAS once again operating in the shadows, hunting terrorist leaders, and dismantling networks before they could strike. When ISIS captured Mosul, Raqqa, and vast territories in Iraq and Syria in 2014, their rapid expansion shocked the world. They executed civilians, enslaved women, and carried out terror attacks across the globe. Their propaganda machine recruited thousands of foreign fighters, including from the UK and Europe, and their goal was clear: establishing an Islamic caliphate and launching global terror attacks. The US and UK couldn't afford to let ISIS grow. Coalition airstrikes began, but special forces were needed on the ground to direct precision air raids, train local fighters, and conduct high-risk raids on ISIS leadership. Because Britain wasn't officially at war in Syria, SAS missions were highly classified, but reports confirmed their presence as early as 2015, working with US Special Forces and Kurdish fighters. They disguised themselves as local fighters, blending into war zones, conducting long-range sniper missions, eliminating high-profile ISIS targets, and rescuing hostages, including Western journalists and aid workers. One of their biggest successes was the elimination of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in 2019. While US Delta Force conducted the final raid, it was SAS intelligence operations that played a key role in tracking his movements. Working closely with MI6 and Kurdish intelligence, the SAS pinpointed his location, leading to a final US-led assault that resulted in his death.
He died like a dog.
One of the most effective SAS strategies against ISIS was the deployment of long-range snipers, also known as the kill teams. In 2015, an SAS sniper in Iraq took out an ISIS executioner from over 1,000 meters away, just seconds before he could behead a civilian. In 2016, another SAS sniper eliminated an ISIS commander from 1.5 miles away, one of the longest sniper kills in history. By 2017, SAS teams were actively tracking and neutralizing British jihadists who had joined ISIS, ensuring they never returned to the UK to launch attacks. The constant fear of SAS snipers forced ISIS leaders to stay on the move, disrupting their ability to plan and coordinate attacks. For the first time, the SAS fully integrated drone technology into their missions. They used small, silent drones to track ISIS movements, coordinated airstrikes with Reaper and Predator drones, and pioneered the use of AI-assisted battlefield analytics, identifying targets faster than ever before. One major drone mission involved tracking an ISIS bomb-making factory, which was later destroyed in a precision airstrike. This marked a new evolution for the SAS. They were no longer just elite ground troops, but masters of cyber warfare, drone technology, and real-time battlefield intelligence. As ISIS lost ground in Syria and Iraq, they began expanding into North Africa, particularly in Libya and the Sahel region, Mali, Niger, Chad, Al-Qaeda-linked groups launched brutal attacks across Africa, including mass kidnappings and executions. SAS teams were deployed in secret, training local forces, and conducting targeted raids on high-value terrorist leaders. They worked alongside MI6, French Special Forces, and the CIA to eliminate terror cells before they could reach Europe. In one high-risk mission, an SAS strike team ambushed an ISIS convoy in Libya, stopping them from smuggling weapons into Europe. By 2018, Russia had fully entered the Syrian conflict, backing President Bashar al-Assad and his forces. This created a dangerous proxy war, where Western special forces and Russian-backed mercenaries operated in the same areas. Intelligence reports suggested that Britain's SAS and Russia's Wagner Group may have engaged in secret skirmishes, competing for control over strategic regions. While the British government never confirmed direct engagements, the situation pushed the SAS into a new kind of battlefield, one involving hybrid warfare, misinformation campaigns, and intelligence battles in the Syrian desert. While the SAS fought wars abroad, they were also tasked with protecting Britain from terrorist attacks at home. After the rise of ISIS, several deadly attacks hit the UK. The 2017 Manchester Arena bombing killed 22 civilians, the London Bridge attack left 8 dead, and the 2019 London Bridge stabbing targeted innocent civilians. To combat the growing threat, the British government activated Operation Temperer, deploying SAS and counter-terror units across the UK. Undercover SAS operatives were stationed in high-risk areas, gathering intelligence on potential attackers, and working closely with MI5, GCHQ and UK counter-terrorism police to prevent future attacks. One leaked report even suggested that SAS teams were stationed in London during the 2017 attacks, ready to intervene if necessary. As of today, the SAS continues to operate in total secrecy, but experts believe their future missions will focus on 3 key areas: cyber warfare, drone-led operations, and undercover missions against state-backed threats. With the rise of AI-driven combat, the SAS is likely to integrate artificial intelligence into battlefield decision-making. They will also rely even more on autonomous and AI-assisted drone strikes to eliminate targets without ever setting foot on the battlefield. And as tensions between Russia and China escalate, MI6 and the SAS may conduct secret missions to counter intelligence threats in ways we may never hear about. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the battlefields of Syria to the streets of London, the SAS has evolved into one of the most lethal, adaptable, and advanced special forces units in history. But as new threats arise, one question remains: what will the SAS's next mission be? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into military history, elite special forces, and the untold stories of warfare. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching.